group of 5 people on a panel. But in this case, we're hearing from folks who have been successful with their grant applications, and I really feel like the larger the diversity of kinds of projects we can learn about, the better we will be positioned to devise projects that work for us. So I want to, at this time, invite Carly, Geoff, Patricia, Jessie, and Valerie to join me at the front, please, and thank you. Woo! Speaking of round of applause, while they get themselves seated, can we have the biggest round of applause for our amazing speakers in the last round? With like sand falling out of his mouth, being like, I can't do this, I need water. Thank you to all of you, this was fantastic. So here we are, hi guys, hi. It's sort of an awkward thing, I'm like floating behind you, it's a bit awkward. So what we're gonna do, and I am, as I said, keeping time, we have 63 minutes, and in that time, I'm looking to have all of these wonderful folks share with you a little bit about their projects and a lot about their process. And there's definitely going to be an opportunity for question and answer from the audience as well. So I want to just kick us off with a very simple, and if we can try to sort of keep it brief, obviously there's 5 of us and we want to share the air. But if we could just go along, and we've got a couple mics that you can share between you, and just introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and give us an outline of your project in sort of 2 minutes, give or take.
Hi, my name is Patricia Huntsman, and I work with Arts BC. Arts BC is dedicated to providing the tools and support for individuals and organizations to excel at arts and culture. So it runs the gamut from community-based organizations up to professional, individual artists, creative entrepreneurs, etc. So our project, first of all, I think we have to say the Canada Council Digital Strategies Fund grant was the easiest grant I have ever written. Super easy. And when in doing that, our project is around digital literacy, and it's called Arts BC DigiStarts program. And what we're doing is we're trying to take a baseline of what is the sort of digital comfort levels around the province. And from there, what we're going to do is work on a sort of co-creation model. We don't want to just build another toolkit. There's another freaking toolkits everywhere. I think these projects always result in toolkits. I hope we avoid a toolkit. And if you do want a really good digital toolkit, Making Digital Work, if you Google that, that's a fantastic toolkit. So there's already one out there. So what we're going to do is work on sort of a co-creation model as to what are the tools that people need around digital and building sort of digital comfort levels in organizations as well as with individual artists. And the lens that we're sort of taking on that is a bit of a sort of borrowing from video game design, and it's using game design theory and to sort of create a user experience around creating these sort of digital supports. So we kind of don't really know what it's actually going to look like in the end yet, and I think that's the important piece about this fund, is that it allows to go and try things, but the result is that we want people to end up having an increase in digital understandings and applications in their organization at the outcome of this, so in a year and a half. So kind of take the measure right now, where are you at, and then a year and a half sort of see what's your comfort level in either as an individual or organization. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Valerie Singh-Turner. I'm a theater artist. I perform, I write, I produce. I founded a company called Visceral Visions about 13 years ago. And our mandate is to champion voices that struggle to be heard in our increasingly globalized and homogenized societies, and that means we have a specific mandate to foster and develop indigenous. My keeps kind of cutting out. Indigenous, racialized, and female-identified voices. So we got $250,000, thank you very much, Canada Council, from the Digital Strategy Fund, to support the development and build of Diverse Theatre BC, which is a project that I've been trying to get off the ground for 3 years now. And actually, one of those things, it was one of those projects that was a big vision looking for funding, and none of it wasn't fitting anywhere until the Digital Strategy Fund came along. And if the Digital Strategy Fund hadn't come along, I would have given up. So Diverse Theatre BC is envisioned to be a digital platform. Its central tool will be a searchable database of Indigenous and racialized theatre artists in BC. We're starting just in the BC region. And that will include not just performers, but directors, designers, playwrights, stage managers, choreographers, dancers, opera singers, like anybody who works professionally in the theatre area. It's an interdisciplinary arts form, and so we're being as inclusive as possible within that realm. And after that first stage of building the database, we want to hopefully find the model, best practices model that is financially sustainable, and then expand across the country to become Diverse Theatre Canada, and hopefully then expand across the other arts sectors. So it's a bit overwhelming when I think about it sometimes, but what its possibilities are, but I'm very excited because of the many possibilities that are inherent in this project.
Hi, my name is McKee, and my job title is Head of Strategy at 221A. You might know the organization previously as a gallery, so in 2017 we left that as kind of our central infrastructure and rooted the program in an infrastructure development model, so looking at cultural producers, artists, curators, writers, architects, critical thinkers, be more concerned with developing kind of infrastructure. And so looking at infrastructure from a social, cultural, ecological point of view. And I think artists and cultural producers have a lot to say about the structures that we inhabit, and also the kind of trashy conditions of those structures, so that we can find better equity for the people who we want to serve. We all inherit those systems, but what can we do to create ones to make them better? So that came along before the Digital Strategies Fund for us as an organization, and then when the Digital Strategies Fund was announced, it seemed like a really good marriage for us to try and work with this funding. And our project openly proposed to kind of look at the blockchain space, which is a digital economy, but also kind of a database and knowledge kind of technology that's emerging in Vancouver and many other cities and many other tech hubs. And we're trying to work across the board with researchers from the cultural realm, but also from the technological realm in the first phase of our project, to look at all the use cases that are being proposed for the cultural industries within this technology. And then it's going to report back with a report that, part of our strategy is to share it all with our colleagues. So there'll be some dissemination channels, and then figure out what the best use cases are for the industry, and then specifically for us within our organization, we're going to develop kind of a strategy with that knowledge in mind, and then the third phase is then to implement it and kind of educate all of our kind of 221A's constituents, which range from being a long-term fellow, which is, if you're doing research and project development with us, can be up to 3 years. We also manage 4 cultural use properties throughout East Vancouver and downtown, and we also have a public art site, and we have a library in Chinatown that we program as well.
Great. I guess I'll use this, yeah. I'm Carla Frey. I'm the managing director of Nordicity's Vancouver office. Nordicity is an international consulting firm working across the creative, cultural, digital industries. We're partnered with Patricia Huntsman on the Arts BC's DigiStarts program, but we're also leading a couple others in Ontario, so I just wanted to briefly highlight one of those, which is really interesting, and I think very relevant to the BC ecosystem. It's called the Toronto Arts of Tomorrow Initiative, TATI, And it's really trying to look at this common splintering between disciplines in the arts and bring together what are now currently 11 major cultural organizations, MCOs in Toronto, including all of the big players you can think of: National Ballet, TIFF, Luminato, Canadian Stage, Art Gallery of Ontario, Pride, Harbourfront Centre, and trying to consider what are some common opportunities, challenges, barriers in their work in preparation to the digi world of 2025 is kind of how it's pitched, imagining what that might look like, how to remain competitive in it, and what needs to kind of change between now and then. So this is just a really interesting example of where some common problems were identified, some thought leaders came to the fore, led an application amongst a very diverse group of players, and are now in the midst of developing. It's a multi-phase project, but key pilot projects within this that will look at kind of key issues such as like common marketing campaigns, looking at data analytics, looking at content distribution in new ways, shared platforms for that, a kind of innovation factory is another one. I can kind of go through them perhaps the next stage of descriptions, because it's quite this complex multi-tiered outcome at the moment, but it is a pilot. And I think one thing I would drive home working here in Vancouver and with many of your organizations and affiliates is that audience analytics piece that is really missing here. And there's such a demand and an appetite, I think, from many of those in the room and others for a shared understanding of how we create better linked up marketing campaigns, what kinds of independent agencies or platforms could support that initiative. So all to say I'm around and can give you a lot more information about the TATI initiative in Toronto. There is increasingly a little bit more of a web presence for it as well, but that's all for now. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Geoff Horner, and I do art support work with an organization called Culture that's in Masset. And Culture was started by Gwai and Jocelyn, who are Haida artists, and it started out of a play that they did called Singigangu, which is all in the Haida language. And the work that I've been doing with them has been more recently doing support for their fundraising and also project support and design support. The project that we're doing we've called the Haida Arts and Culture web app. And I think as when I proposed the idea with Jocelyn and Gwai,
Who we have behind you.
oh, there they are, to apply for the fund, it sort of had all these links back for them to ideas of the research that they'd done in museums, going to look at Haida pieces all around the world, wherever they sit, in Sweden, some of them in the UK, and how to collect them together in one spot where they can continue their research and potentially share it with others. And I think as we go forward, it's really going to be a process. I think some of the speakers this morning talked about how designing an app is a lot about the actual social process involved in bring the code together, because it's really about the use. Who are the users and what are their needs, and how do we build it carefully in a way that's relevant to them?
Ooh, thanks, team. Okay, so we have an app cataloging and collecting and making available Haida art and culture. We have a multi-stakeholder visioning exercise looking at the digital world of 2025 and spinning out a bunch of pilots out of that. We have a blockchain project, question mark, amazing. It's literally all I can say about blockchain. We have a diverse theater database and online platform, and we have an attempt to measure or audit the level of comfort with digital literacy here in British Columbia. So this is the diversity of kinds of projects, and also this is just scratching the surface. So what I'd like for us to try to spend the next chunk of time on is really on the question of process. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is the first step in getting $250,000 from the Digital Strategies Fund is that you have to figure out what you're trying to solve, what kind of technology is going to solve that thing, and who you're going to work with to do that project, including both community partners and folks that will be served, as well as probably technical partners, technical expertise, etc. And then you have to put that all together in a digestible format that can turn into a grant proposal. So what I'd love to hear from each of you is about that process. So what I want to say now is there's so much in the room, there's so much that these folks can share with us, and I would invite you, if any one of them has talked about a project that sounds like it might be something that you want to learn more about or might apply to your situation, to find them, get their business card, connect on one of the many digital platforms that we all use, and talk more at length about the whys and wherefores of the project at another time. But this time is about that process. How did you get from the idea to the grant proposal? Because that's what y'all are going to be up to. Geoff, would you kick us off?
Okay. So basically, we're talking first about the need.
Yeah. So how did you like? What was the process around? Like, how did you identify this is a thing we want to do? Who do we think we need to work with to make this happen? And then how do we? What was the process, if any, to get it to the stage of being pitched in the grant proposal?
So, like I said, the need was, and I think it was articulated by Jocelyn and Guai, but also it's been around the whole community for a long time. It's just that there are these art pieces from ancestors and from more recent artists that are all over the world, and they're in museum collections as part of so there's a museum and then there's the Haida collection in the museum. And wouldn't it be interesting to create a Haida collection where the museums are a subsection of that, so you could look up an art piece that you're interested in and find out where in the world that is instead of the other way around. And so it's kind of like a meta collection of Haida artworks. It's very based in the community. It will have, the artworks that will come into it will have to do with who participates, etc. And it's also a place where those pieces can be, someone, for example, Jocelyn and Guai have gone to the Field Museum in Chicago and they've taken down all kinds of notes about different pieces, very specific angles of a carving or something. And this is where they can go and take their own notes. And our idea is that the notes could be private initially, but shareable so that you can collaborate with other artists, but you can also have your sort of own catalog of comments that come up about each piece that's in the database. The other aspect is, just like I said, in terms of reversing those categories of Haida versus the museum, is also how to present, how would you go about a web app from a Haida perspective? So how would you incorporate Haida principles into this environment? And that's very much where the building the app is much more of a social process, where we're actually sitting around a table talking with knowledge holders and talking with coders to think about how do we actually bring this to bear. And part of it, of course, is going to be through the artwork, through the sort of branding, but also through the pathways that you can go through. So there's, just to give an example, there's Yakudang, which is respect. I'm not Haida, by the way. I'm just trying to do my best to repeat the Haida words. Ginawaluhang gu at quagida, so that's interconnectedness. And then Gina Kadanga Giutul Gudang, seeking wise counsel. So those are really, really broad ideas that are part of these 6 principles that have been adopted for their marine plan, for the Haida Nation and things like that. So how to actually bring them into it. Is it, with the idea to sort of share those and teach about those, or how do they become a part of this? And then of course the connection to the land. And that's something that I was interested in to hear about this morning, was how because the digital environment has been around for so long now, how are people now bringing it into their everyday embodied lives and kind of using the digital technologies, but kind of going offline at the same time, because the Haida are very land-based, and their teachings are all from the land, and we hope to bring those into the database, but into this web app. But how do we then generate the interest in going out and learning from the land in an experiential way? So I'll pass that.
So Nordicity was also working with Lord Cultural Resources, another firm you may have heard, often working in the museum space, as well as OCAD. And part of this was an outcome of an impact measurement study that Nordicity led for the City of Toronto's arts grant. So looking at what the impact of the 60% increase over 4 years had really been. And one of the recommendations was, if the city doesn't keep up the momentum, the feds and the province won't really pick up the slack. So what could we do? What kind of initiative would bring some people together around some of this impact that had been evidenced, but also making use of, obviously, the Digital Strategy Fund. So it really, I guess the answer to your question, what made it happen in trying to bring these very diverse players with their own territories and egos and whatnot was does everyone know what FOMO is? It was really the biggest case of fear of missing out I think we had ever seen, and it was great because there was a leader that came to the surface, and that was Harbour Front Centre, but the city was there, so that gave some credibility. And then slowly, like the 11th hour, everyone was like, no, I'm gonna, and it was very little risk on their parts, which is, the beauty of a collective effort like this. And it was very little investment, and it pivoted really from, it was gonna be a $500K 3-year project to the transformation fund stream that you may have read about. So it's a nice tidy piece that is smaller and shorter and less maybe scary, but also has the potential to have a legacy. So one of the outcomes of TATI is to have TATI itself live on with governance and kind of a sustainability mandate, which will then be well positioned to apply for the next kind of round of funding and whatnot. So that's just kind of something to think about, in that it doesn't have to be fully thought through. That's something that's come up a lot on the panel anyway. But really, once you get those key champions involved, then it's the snowballing effect. I'm absolutely convinced was what propelled this forward and became ultimately a successful bid.
Good.
This microphone seems to be just being.
You want to just use this one?
Yeah,
Let's just use that one.
Great.
I guess so from our end, as kind of a younger organization, when multi-year large pots of funding become available, it's very attractive to us because that helps us stabilize. So we thought, how can we get into this kind of this program? So we went through a couple of rounds of, is this the right project? Is this the right project? Can we partner with a larger museum, and can we do a social media kind of project that focuses on WeChat, because a lot of our kind of user base is kind of Chinese languages oriented, so that might make sense for the museum to learn from us to learn from kind of our constituency, but no, content generation, social media didn't seem to fit, so we went through all these issues. But then, looking at some of the outlying spaces within the digital realm that are kind of ripe for development and innovation became kind of a natural orientation for us. Personally, I had a very good kind of, I guess, tutor in this realm. I went to Hong Kong last year for a residency, and it turned out the patron who paid for my residency was really involved in the blockchain space. He liked to take me to rugby matches. There was a rugby sevens tournament, so very short rugby games, 7 minutes each, perfect for someone who doesn't like sports. But we can have a great conversation between those things. So we did. We had a couple great conversations over a long weekend. And then that kind of stuck with me as being like, okay, this sounds like it's going to be really foundational to the development of the digital realm. Potentially a new kind of web might develop from this that we don't know what it looks like yet. So that kind of attractive innovationness of blockchain was where kind of we went. There's only 6 of us on the team, so 2 of us out of that kind of did some more thorough research, looked at who the players were locally, nationally, internationally, who might want to partner with us. And it turned out Vancouver is a very big hub for this technology, part in part because financial AI is a big component of Vancouver's tech scene, but then also learning that the blockchain realm and the marijuana industry are basically working in tandem, and they're going to leapfrog each other into a new business model. Sounded like, okay, what's that going to look like? Let's follow along. And out of that, I can say our project, how did we find the people who want to work with us? Well, surprisingly, in the digital realm, a lot of people want to work with artists and with cultural organizations because we have experiences that they don't have. I don't have the programming knowledge. I mean, my training's in being a political attaché, an artist, and then a curator. And so, when I go into these realms, I feel very self-conscious that I don't have all the programming knowledge in this. But what I found out is that you don't actually need that stuff. They're just happy to have a conversation with you, and you're not judged for not having that knowledge. Your new knowledge is seen as your asset, and the conversations that you can bring forth because of where you come from are very vital to a lot of people. So, some people within the blockchain realm might say like, oh, we have a brilliant idea to have a globally understood provenance system so that all ownership of artworks is on a public ledger. Well, there'll be some issues with that because a lot of institutions, a lot of private collectors, a lot of owners of cultural properties might not want that information out in the public realm because it might mean a lot of repatriation. So there'll be a real world problem with that kind of brilliant idea for the technology. So we come in where we can kind of mitigate that a bit and say like, well, actually people in culture might be resistant to that at first, and here's why. And so that's kind of the stuff that you bring to the table. Other parts of the question, how do we, what was the other question?
You're
We're
good.
good?
That's
Okay.
great. Thank you.
So, need. We are trying to address this really tiny problem called systemic racism. The theatre community in Canada has been grappling with this issue in some pretty controversial ways. Probably the most recent high-profile example would be Robert Lepage ×2. For those who don't know, his production of Slav and his production of Canada, which Slav was taking African slave songs and featuring a white lead singer backed by a chorus of women, 4 of whom were also white. So only 2 out of 7 were black, and at some point they were pretending to pick cotton. And then he announced that he was doing this piece in collaboration with a French company, a very well-known company in France, called Canada, which was supposed to be looking at the interactions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada with the white colonizers, settlers who came to this land. There was not a single Indigenous person, artist, in any key creative role involved in that. And so, so that's just the most recent and very big examples of how systemic racism influences our arts institutions and our artistic practices. And so Diverse Theatre BC came out of some very practical things, like there are engagers who are very much want to engage with Indigenous and racialized artists, but they don't have the tools to find these artists. And so there were artists like myself who became like volunteer casting directors. We would have people contact us and say, hi, I'm looking for so-and-so to do this kind of role, and can you help? And of course you want to help because you want to help your friends and your colleagues get work, but I have to eat as well and pay my rent, and so I don't have time or energy because I'm a practicing artist myself So, and I have my own work that I want to do. So I thought that this database would be a very practical way of addressing several different problems. But the thing that most excited me about it was the ability for us to find each other and to build our creative community and empower that community and to because as a community of Indigenous and racialized artists, we have a lot of conversations and ideas that I think would be of interest to the wider world, but we don't have access to the same resources. And so I was thinking that a digital infrastructure might help us because we don't have access to the physical infrastructures that have been offered to other groups historically. In terms of partners, I think I'm really fortunate that as I was thinking about this, I was also got some funding to actually build a website for my company. It was already, my company was more than a decade old, and we still didn't have a website, again, because of lack of capacity and resources. And so once we got the funding through the Canada Council, through the Equity Office to do that, I met Philip Joie. Where did he go?
He's just outside the room.
So we partnered on creating Visceral Vision's website, and I was also talking about the database then, and so he was super helpful in helping me start to visualize about what this could look like, because I'm not a tech person at all. So I think I'm an artist who has a very who has this way of looking at the bigger picture and also trying to understand the roots of problems. Like the world is overwhelming because there's constantly fires everywhere that everyone's trying to put out. And I always try to think, what is below all these fires? How can we stop these fires from happening in the first place? And so, so while the database is definitely the thing that everybody really wanted like 3 years ago, I'm also thinking about how we create a digital online community that will be more than a database, that will address a lot of these systemic issues that keep coming up over and over again, that exhausts us all because we're always trying to address things that are not of our making, but we are the ones that have to somehow solve them. So along with Philip, I have a really awesome board of directors, and we were trying to expand our board outreach, and so it just sort of crossed over into this whole process that we're trying to refresh and expand our board. And one of the first people we approached was Brenda Ledley, who is the executive director of the BC Alliance for Arts and Culture, and
She'll be back. She just
was
popped out for
here
an
as
appointment.
well.
She'll be back. She'll be back.
And she said, no, I don't want to sit on a board. But she was willing to sit on a working committee, and so we said, okay, we'll create a diverse theater working committee, and from there we invited Philip, and we invited Jay Dodge, who is also here, who at the time was president of the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres, and we also invited Kenji Maeda, who is the executive director of the Greater Vancouver Professional Theatre Alliance. His predecessor, Don Brennan, was a big supporter of the project even before that. So Dawn Brennan is also on it. She's the managing director of Urban Inc. now. And have I forgotten? And now we've just asked Scott Bellis, who is the president of the National Council for Canadian Actors Equity Association. So as you can see that we've partnered up as a working group, sort of the leaders of the major stakeholders in the theatre, Canadian theatre sector, which I think was another reason why our grant was successful, because it's a community-driven initiative. The other thing that we did was, while we were trying to get some major financial support to it, we did manage to get some smaller support from the City of Vancouver and from the Hammer Foundation, just a few $1,000s, enough to do some community consultations, research. It was very simple. It was about a year ago in 2017, yes. in the spring of 2017. And so we held 4 focus groups, facilitated focus groups, 2 of which were just for Indigenous and artists of color, and 2 were for people who might be engagers. And so we basically asked questions like, do you need a database? And, you know, what, it was just like, and how often would you use it? And would you pay for it? Just like really basic questions of finding out community need. And in addition to the focus groups, we also did an online survey, and we also did phone interviews because we wanted to make it a province-wide initiative. We called artistic directors on the island and further out in the interior. So all told, we had about 160 people engaged with our research, and those numbers were very helpful for the jury to understand that, for us to demonstrate the need for this tool. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. In terms of process for our project, we ended up receiving 91,000 is what we applied for, because we saw that there's probably going to be more phases of the work that needs to be done on building digital literacy in BC. So, and I think it's important to point out there's a lot of different ways that we can go about this. I mean, I think just getting out there and playing and trying new things and having an openness in your organization towards digital is probably, you know, that's the greatest thing you can do as sort of a step one. But in terms of our project, it just naturally aligned with the mandate of the organization, specifically that Arts BC is, you know, trying to foster and nurture creative ecosystems in our province, and also that we're dedicated to community cultural development. So the objectives of the fund completely aligned with the purposes of the project. And because one of the key ways that we work is through knowledge sharing. So about, you know, nearly 365 days a year, we are posting really strong curated content across a variety of channels to help bolster and help individuals and arts organizations really excel at arts and culture. And it's not just reposts of crap things for your organization. It's actually really thoughtfully curated content. And it just, when we're kind of always in touch with users, and I think in part of the process we sort of learned, okay, you know, who's keen on learning more about this. And in the research that we did sort of in the preliminary planning, it was actually sort of a process of elimination, because there was a lot of different approaches we could take for digital literacy and building that. And we kind of had to vet down a few times in our conversations that Carly and I were having. And we looked at the research to date, and you can probably tell me, but we saw that from the research to date that digitally comfortable organizations, that they tend to be support and tools-based organizations. They tend to be in larger centers. They're mostly in Ontario. They also are already probably working in intermedia arts. They're less so in theater, actually. It is what the research sort of showed, that there was just a bit more kind of comfort level in those other types of organizations. So we're looking at this, and it just kind of, another sort of point in the research that sort of influenced the process as to how we go about it is, I had been in London in the UK at the end of 2015 and attended the Remix Summit, which brought together culture, technology, and entrepreneurs. And it was absolutely fantastic, because the first day was at the British Museum and the second day was at Google headquarters, and it had every major cultural institution across the UK, and as well as major media groups such as Bloomberg, obviously Google as well, but it also had like Jamie Oliver Group and MTV. And what was really cool about that is these organizations were reporting out on the digital strategy funding that they had received in 2012 and 2013. So what I used was the learnings from that, because they were sharing all of their learnings, that, you know, this is what we did with our fund, this is how it influenced our organization, or what have you. And basically, sort of in prepping for the oncoming Digital Strategy Fund, we kind of knew, like, okay, here's lessons learned from these other organizations and how we can approach that. So it really did help to influence how we approach the grants, so we could be a bit more targeted. Other points on the process, I think, were
that we didn't want it to feel, and again, this is more of we're taking sort of like more of an open approach to it, because we don't want it to feel like you need to learn this, and this. We want it to be more of a co-creation kind of feel, get that baseline and sort of understanding of what is digital and increase that comfort level in organizations, certainly. But we don't want it to feel like a real top-down approach. And part of that is to just really kind of create these better conversations in communities so that there is a bit more comfort level. And the other piece that kind of went into the grant formation is really borrowing a lot of lessons from tech, from working with technology companies, and they really, they don't care if you've been working in the arts for 40 years. Like, they're just going for it, right? There's an idea of play, there's an idea of openness. They're just like, go for it, let's solve a problem, that kind of thing. So it's, I think some of the things that we wanted to kind of foster through this program is also looking at, just changing and nurturing our ecosystems around the arts, and that, there needs to be more openness, I think. We can welcome new voices and that sort of thing. And so that's sort of the lens through which, I suppose, probably less than the process, but sort of the lens and our intent behind kind of what we're doing. And again, it was just kind of more of a process of elimination, because we could attack this from a lot of different ways, but we thought, let's try this, and let's try to build in some fun in it by, taking things from learnings from video game design and designing this project and this program that we're going to be carrying out for a little while. So yeah, sort of it.
Okay. Okay. So we have a program there was a need identified, there was external research done, so it's other people's learning that was gathered to inform. Then we have a project where there is a clear experience of an issue that was widely spread, and some very deliberate research going out to talk to the people who are impacted and see whether or not this idea is actually going to work, and then connecting up with a series of partners that made all kinds of sense with the diverse theater database. We have a situation in which it was actually the technology first. It was like, what is this blockchain situation? And then part of the research was like a personal mentorship. There's like a learning about what's possible here. What could this look like? What's going on with this? And then pursuing that and figuring out, how could this technology serve our organization and our mission and the mission of our constituents? We have an example of a sort of massive scale, all the big players coming in to do a sort of a foreshadowing, visioning exercise into 2025, where a key component was FOMO, right? Like, no jokes. Getting the right people in the room that will help bring the other people in the room that you might need to have in the room in order to make your project viable. And then we have an example of sort of starting with wanting to flip the script on the museum and the art piece, and then also looking for, how do we design this through that reflects Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledge keeping, so that when this tool ultimately is shared, it will be usable and it will be integratable into communities that are interested in being able to follow Haida art across the world. So huge diversity in different projects here. We have 20 minutes, and I'd love to open it up to you. So this would be a time where you want to think about landing the plane. So get to the heart of your question. I'm going to come around with the wireless. I'm going to trade y'all. I hope that, will this wired guy make it all the way to the end? Oh, it will. What a delight. So please feel free to ask any questions. You can ask them of one person, or you can ask them of everyone. We have 20 minutes. I'll start with Landon.
My question is specifically for you, Valerie. In terms of your database, I'm wondering if you have a list of artists included in that.
So we will be having more artist consultations in the fall, which we will be sending out an invitation as widely as possible for artists from all groups, as long as they intersect with being Indigenous or racialized. We are having consultations with that's specifically for queer, Indigenous, racialized artists, and then another group that is for Indigenous artists only, another group for artists who identify as deaf, who are neurodiverse, or differently abled in another way. It's weird to put them all together, I recognize that, but we will have a co-facilitator who is also deaf for that session. And so I personally don't know a lot of deaf artists who are Indigenous and racialized, and so I'm looking to the community to spread the word on that. Our goal is to be as inclusive as possible, so that's a lot of the work ahead of us. Thank you for that question.
I'm interested to know where the business model is in all this. Because at the end of the day, we can have the grant, well, I guess all of you can kind of process this. One of the challenges that we faced from the north, from Fort St. John in the north, Indigenous communities were isolated from the marketplace. So we need technology in order to put it out there. So one of the things that I'm doing with the Game On project is integrated into the community comprehensive plan. Now, what's the next step? Well, corporate sponsors and turn that into a business model. So I haven't heard too much about the sustainability of the model. So if you can comment on what's the next step after you got the grant, developed it, and are we moving it into a business model, or are we staying at the, I'm an artist, I want to create, but then at the end of the day, you still gotta sell your product, or you got to do something with it to maintain it.
I think the intent on our project is to really keep that open as to what the end product is going to look like, and really get users to inform us once we kind of have a baseline of what their needs are. But certainly making that accessible province-wide is part of that. Going around the province is part of our work that's going forward. But I think what could result from this is certainly what we want to see is some kind of tool that ideally, it aligns with the provincial government's strategic plan for Canada, or BCAC's strategic plan for the arts. We want to see it align with other initiatives as well. But I think it's also, we kind of have like 4 quadrants, right? There's creative entrepreneurship. You can be an innovator within your own institution. You can be an actual disruptor, or you can be a remixer. And a remixer is sort of applying existing technology to within your own discipline or within the arts. And I think we need to kind of look at each of those quadrants as we do our projects. So we want to keep that open for now before we get into it. But yeah, there's, I think, definitely potential commercialization of something that is usable around the province eventually.
So part of our funding is to give us the time and resources to find the business model for this project. Part of our research that we did last year was asking engagers if they would be willing to pay for this service, and if so, how much. And so we got a range. I think it was like 75%, no, more like 80% said they were willing to pay for it, and then whether it was like a one-time only thing, if you're like a fringe artist, or you're a big company that does several productions a year, so you would have a larger annual fee for unlimited use. We were also looking at, there's all models out there, talent databases. The biggest one is probably Casting Workbook, which is the largest casting application for the film and television industry. And so their model is that the actors pay. So I'm a member of UBCP ACTRA. Every year I pay $100 to Casting Workbook, so that casting directors and my agent can access my materials and submit me for different projects. I didn't want an artist pay model because Indigenous and racialized artists are the least employed and have the fewest opportunities. And so I was definitely looking at a user kind of model, but it's not practical for the artist to pay nothing. And I've found that if people don't pay for something, they don't value it either. And so the artist would probably have a nominal fee, you know, just to make sure their stuff is upgraded. We'll hopefully be adding other tools that would help them, like project management systems or advocacy tools, or we're looking at a lot of other things that could enhance the service for the artists. But the other, another model we could be looking at, or an additional thing we could be looking at, is once we've got a best practices model, maybe it would be licensed to other regions, because it doesn't make sense for us in BC to try to recruit artists in Toronto. We're just not on the ground, and we don't have the resources to do that, and frankly that's something I'm not interested in doing myself personally, because I want to do my art. But we could license it to another company out there, an Indigenous company, or another company that has an intercultural mandate. And it would be sort of maybe a revenue generator for them. They would sign up the engagers who are in that area and the artists, and we would just take a small percentage as our licensing fee, but they would hopefully have some extra revenue to fund more artistic work. So, so we're looking at a few different things, and we will be working with a business consultant to figure out how we can do that.
Yeah, I would say directly that part of our proposal was to help solve some of the obsolescence that was built into our organization's own business model. And so part of that for us is like part of the organization is a social enterprise, and that we manage for cultural use multi-tenant properties. However, there's a problem within our model because we're not the building owners, we're the master leaseholders. And so while we're able to secure a master lease for 10, 15, 20 years on properties, use cultural infrastructure money to upgrade the facilities, apportion the spaces, and then manage that with the subtenants, we're really vulnerable when we reach that 10, 15, 20-year mark and those master leases come up. We're back into the kind of precarity of the market, and the landowners can do whatever they want at that point with that master lease. So we could lose out on that. So part of our plan was to find out, is there a way to use blockchain platforms to better track the equity that our tenants might put into the properties, and then how can we use the technology to generate more revenue to transition from being master leaseholders to property owners throughout that period of 10, 15, 20 years, depending on whatever property we're looking at. Secondly, and then there is a proprietary side to it, is that if we are successful in this, you know, the organization then has something to take to market to say, listen, we have a very interesting way to think about multi-use facilities, multi-tenant facilities, even like this space here, the Post. This could be a new way to imagine sharing space and really feeling like, you know, the real interesting thing around blockchain is that it takes security and kind of trust down to very individual and kind of small organizational levels, where previously you would have to place that in a master institution like a bank or a state-run land registry and all that sort of stuff. So there's all kinds of stuff happening within this technology that's going to reorient our understanding of what it means to have a land registry, to be a property owner, and it's a lot to talk about, so I'll just pass on. If you have questions, kind of we can talk afterwards.
Yeah, I'm around to speak to that, but just, you know, the TATI initiative, the heart of it is really looking at transforming business models to stay competitive and to be relevant within the next 10 years or so. So that's at the heart of it, and the kind of sustainability aspect will be the existence of TATI itself as a kind of governing body. But even thinking about the rural-urban connect and some of your points earlier, part of it is around content management systems, so looking at where organizations are looking at capacity building to sustain and archive their content. So with the tagline of like produce once, publish any platform, and what will that look like in terms of even the potential of video streaming and archiving. So that's like one of the sub-pilot projects, for example. But just to also highlight, you know, I'm glad Patricia brought up the UK's R&D fund. So this was a collaboration between Nesta and the Arts Council in the UK, which, you know, they're always sometimes considered a few years ahead of Canada, but they published a huge evaluation of their research and development digital fund that was extremely honest. Like, we look at it as one of these, you know, benchmarks of like, this is how we kind of screwed up and this is what worked and didn't, or and a lot of that's to do with business models and sustainability planning and making sure that's kind of built into projects from the start. So that's a huge wealth of publicly available information for everyone. And also in Arts in a Digital World, not to like flag our own report, but with the Canada Council, a lot of the findings from across so many organizations in Canada have to do with sustainability and business model development from the get-go. So I'd urge everyone to look at that as well.
And in our case, like definitely from the outset, we're not launching into business model. I think the value of the grant in this case is just to create the space where a process can be undertaken with the resources where people aren't just, you know, it's not all sort of volunteer off the edge of people's desks. And it's sort of an unknown process that we're undertaking, so there may be, you know, 2 or 3 years down the line, opportunities identified for income generation or for spin-offs or something. But just in the interim, we're looking at partnerships with institutions like the Haida Gwaii Museum as a way to secure sustainability in the short term for ongoing costs, like if we have a app running, we have servers and maintenance of the app and all these different costs. So.
Mine's really concrete and was for Patricia. You had you'd mentioned a couple of you had mentioned that e-report and a lot of good evidence coming from the organizations that were involved and reported on that, and that it shaped you know, how you approached your application. Did you cite any of that work directly in your application? I'll take a yes or no.
I think we did. I think we did, actually. Yeah.
Daniel?
Remy can tell you because we give it to Remy.
All right, perfect. I'm just curious if you could tell us a little bit about how much time and resources you spent in doing the application, like just gauging to actually get the grant, to give us a sense of that.
That is a good one. Time and resources, and I'll just take one last question from Landon.
So, Geoff, you had mentioned about the artwork being in other places, and I'm just curious about how that works. Do you take photographs of the art and do you bring those in? Because my understanding is that you are not allowed to alternate or change the website in any way. So I'm just wondering how that works for you.
So Geoff, why don't you start, and then we'll hear the question of time and resources, which is a real kicker. So off you go.
So there's a lot of different aspects to bring into that question. So in some cases, it's Haida people taking photos of their own ancestors' pieces that have been stored in museums for years without their own access to it, and the pieces may have been stolen or purchased under circumstances of distress or whatever. So there's a politic around repatriation that's currently being undertaken in a whole different, a whole channel of its own that the Haida have been involved sort of at the forefront of. Technically, there's potentially we can speak to other databases, and through APIs or through direct URLs, we could actually just have their image come into ours. That's something that we're currently exploring with the Haida Gwaii Museum with their collection. There is a Haida sort of scholar who has posted 70,000 images of pieces in museums around the world of Haida artworks for Haida people to consult and use to study for their own artwork. So that's definitely part of our exploration, and there will be copyright, intellectual property issues that come up for sure, but it'll be part of our journey.
Okay, I'd like to hear from everyone in 30 seconds, right? I know it's wild, right? What is this crazy person doing with the time? So we want to know about time and money. How much time and how much money did you spend putting together your proposal? Carly, should I start up?
Okay, well, if my boss, senior partner was here, he'd say like 30 years of international consultancy in the cultural and digital industries. But to be honest, and maybe Remy doesn't want me to say this, but it was not a cumbersome process at all. Like the time and investment is finding the right people, getting those champions involved. The application was just very fleet of foot and really straightforward, because I think that's the point that the CCA is putting a value on, being able to do some of the trial and error as part of the project. They're putting an emphasis on that understanding and R&D element of the piece. But yes, I think it's not as bad as you think. That's part of your concerns, and I think there's a lot of opportunity to do the partnership development without thinking about, I put out a 75-page proposal to the Canadian Heritage this morning. It's like nothing like that. Anyway, there's my 30 seconds.
I don't know. Generally, we didn't spend any money doing this. It was all kind of just free conversations and online chat. But I guess probably, I probably spent way more time researching this, because when you're researching new technology, you can go into some very deep holes, and you can spend long, long nights and early mornings doing this outside of the office. So I would probably say at least 3 weeks were spent kind of on my end preparing to write the application. The conversations you have with your partners will be ongoing. But I guess the key in making a good partnership is like finding where you guys have mutual buy-in, where there's mutual satisfaction in the project you're proposing, agreeing that that's there, and then ironing out the details, once the funding is received and then once the project is rolling.
I guess really 3 years because it took all that time for all the things that we were doing anyway to come to fruition, and that's the reason why we got $250,000, because we had all those things in place even though before we knew this money was available. So the research that we did, we spent $7,500 doing the focus groups, the online survey, and the phone interviews. The working group we had already pretty much brought into place again before we knew the funding was coming along. And I think the only other thing I want to add that might be really useful for you is that, and something that the jury cited as being one of the reasons why they supported our grant, was we actually explained we took the time to research what was already out there. So I already mentioned casting workbook. We went and looked at what Playwrights Guild has, what the Associated Designers have, what Equity has or doesn't have. Like, we looked to see what else was out there. There was a First Nations talent bank, so we looked at that too. So we compared all those, we compared the price points, we compared why they worked or didn't work, and how they would be applicable or not applicable to what we were doing. And so we were able to demonstrate that nobody was doing what we wanted to do, or address what we were trying to address.
Fantastic. It didn't take us very much time at all. Again, like, we're partnering with Nordicity, and in my own practice, we're already sort of a bit ahead on the learning. Like, we'd already sort of looked at the research, or in your case, had done the lit review, etc. So we're sort of ready for it, and also ArtsBC's strategic plan and really aligned with all the objectives of the fund. So all of it was just sort of there. So the only sort of effort was me writing the grant, and that didn't take very much time. The only place where we probably did take a little bit of time was just honing in on what we wanted to try and do, because we could have approached it in a number of different ways. So that was probably the only, ruling out things was probably the only time that time was taken, yeah.
And we'll just wrap up with Geoff. Geoff, can you let us know how much time and resources it took?
So the process of posting How to Artworks online would have started over 14,000 years ago when people started. But realistically, I think it just depends on the experience you have on your team. And I have experience doing web design and working with technology, so it was, in terms of the actual application process, like people said, it's very quick, and a lot of it is developing your partners and putting together the sort of framework for it.